Welcome to another episode of MK Does the Rambling Thing about video games for a bit. Let's get right into it, shall we? This is a decent little puzzle platformer. You gain access to different spells that give you a multitude of traversal options, and it's up to you to figure out how to use them to get through the game. What I really dig is how, as you progress, you gain upgrades to your spells that allow you to use them in different ways. It makes you feel like a genius when you figure out how to chain things together in order to get to a ledge or something that seemed unreachable. The art style and music are solid and do a lot to keep you engrossed in the game. While the story isn't much to write home about, the game has a certain charm to it and it doesn't overstay its welcome. I wish I could say the same about the sequel. While it does expand the formula a bit by giving you different moves, it feels like something got lost in the transition from faux 8-bit to faux 16-bit. A lot of the spells you use are more situational this time around instead of being used interchangeably with your core moveset. I can't quite put my finger on why I didn't like this one as much, because visually and musically, it's just an expanded version of the first game, but it didn't grab me as much. Give them both a shot because you might enjoy them for what they are, but personally I feel like the first game is just a teensy bit better presented and flows a bit better. Most of the time I can appreciate a charming little mascot platformer from back in the day just trying to do its own thing. Sadly, this is one of those games that on the surface looks like it would be really cool, but ends up being the perfect example of the term middle of the road. While the character sprites and stuff look great, the gameplay is very tedious. They try to mix things up a bit by giving you stuff like roller skates or a parachute, but it doesn't amount to much more than just trying to get to the end of the level without dying. The problem lies in how clunky everything feels, with some questionable hit detection at times. A lot of the levels are super short, and it feels like you spend more time in loading screens than actually playing the game. I can dig how they try to mix things up, but sadly the game just isn't terribly fun. It's charming, just not great to actually sit down and slog through. Thankfully it's pretty short, so you could probably beat it in a single sitting. Hate to say it, but this game made me sad. I love Dead Rising. The first two games have a special place in my heart when it comes to zombie games, and even the third game did a lot of cool things that I liked, but it was apparent that every new entry got a little worse in many regards. Dead Rising 4 was the nail in the coffin, so to speak, and I can see why. Everything that was fun about the previous games was stripped away, and they tried to focus more on slapstick and really took a lot of the urgency away from the gameplay. Zombies are shredded like paper now, and you're even given things like exosuits to mow through them by the thousands. Combo weapons are easier to make than ever, and while it's still cool to use a few of them, it just feels empty. For every cool thing this game does, it feels like it also takes so many steps backwards. Like, how the hell am I dressed as Bass from Mega Man, mowing down enemies with a bladed bat, and still somehow bored to tears? Even the psychopaths this time around are pretty forgettable, and that's a damn shame. I still find myself going back to play the first few games from time to time, and I can take their faults in stride, but this one, I don't know, man. Something just rubbed me the wrong way, and I was happy to uninstall it. I'm glad I played it just to see what it was about, but I find this one hard to recommend unless you're a diehard and absolutely need to see what it's about. This is a very cool game. It's stylish as all hell and has a neat concept. You're essentially a cowboy who went to Japan to learn how to fight as a samurai. The gameplay is a mix between shooting and using your sword to dispatch enemies, and has a lot of over-the-top weird set pieces. The hardest thing to wrap your head around is probably the way that you perform a lot of the moves. It requires very distinct directional presses in order to perform different types of slashes, or even to do things like reflect projectiles. Hell, you can even spin your sword above your head to kinda helicopter float while platforming. Once you get the hang of things, this game becomes a lot easier, but the main problem is just the overall stiffness of the controls and constantly fighting with the camera. That being said, I think for the time, this game is insanely cool and has one of the best theme songs ever for a character. Like, seriously, go check this game out. It's very cool. Jet Set Radio! Man, I haven't played this since back in the day on Dreamcast. I wanted to give the remaster a shot and I was not disappointed. This game just oozes style, from the heavy cel-shaded graphics to the legendary OST. I still regularly hum to the bass line, if you know what I'm saying. That being said, I do feel like a lot of the platforming and such in this game is aged kind of poorly, and it's really unfortunate because the rest of the game is just so iconic, and it's fun as hell to just cruise around the levels, tagging places up and exploring. really get invested in your own gang and the turf war at hand, but anytime you need to do some precise platforming, it just feels a little loosey-goosey, and while you can eventually learn the mechanics, it doesn't flow quite as well as I would hope. Still though, this is an absolute must-play, if only for the soundtrack alone. I love a good beat 'em up as much as the next guy, and this game has a lot of cool things going for it. It reminds me of some of the other early 3D games of its kind, but sadly, it's another case of style over substance. You don't really have a lot of moves at your disposal, and the enemies tend to feel pretty generic. You just kind of mash buttons and hope for the best while trying to minimize the damage you take. I know that can be said for a lot of beat 'em ups, but it rings especially true for this one. You're just constantly fighting the same guys repeatedly with not much of a switch up. You get some weapons and environmental objects to interact with, but it never really switches up the gameplay enough to be interesting. It's unfortunate because there's a lot of neat cutscenes in different areas you explore, but even the bosses feel kind of one note and never really gave me much trouble. I do, however, love how Kenneth practically never takes his hands out of his pockets while fighting. I just wish there was a little more depth in the combat because this could have been a real standout. Gungage is fucking rad. It's a third-person shooter with some platforming elements sprinkled in, but what sets the game apart in my opinion is the replay value of it. There's multiple characters to unlock, each with their own little story, and even though you find yourself going through the same levels, you either end up in different areas, or you arrive before or after another character, giving you a different perspective on the story. Every character feels pretty distinct from each other, so you have to switch up your playstyle a little bit each time, making every playthrough kind of unique. While the gameplay is nothing too out of the ordinary, it's done in a way that just feels good once you get used to the controls, and it has a very arcadey feel. I honestly expected it to feel a lot more clunky, but everything handles pretty well, and it definitely helps that there's a lot of good songs in the OST too, so the music keeps you going. Try this one out for sure. This is another one of those super stylish arcade style games that just oozes charm. Unfortunately, that charm comes with a fair bit of tedium, and the way this game handles can make or break the experience for you. Personally, I didn't have a problem with it because it felt good to learn the mechanics, but some levels definitely feel a lot more thought out than others. One cool aspect is how you can upgrade your character a bit by giving him things like more bombs, and the story is pretty hilarious, full of interesting voice acting. The one thing I can't forgive in this game is the run up to the final boss. I don't want to spoil too much for you, but there's a section right before the final boss where you need to survive an onslaught of enemies right before you start the fight. That's not too crazy, right? Well, what if I told you that the onslaught lasts approximately 8 full minutes? What if I also told you that you don't get a checkpoint before the boss, so if you die trying to figure out his pattern, you have to do that whole 8-minute section again, every single time. I almost quit at this point just because of how tedious it was, but the game made it personal and I had to see it through to the end. Overall, it's a pretty neat game, but this one section almost ruined it for me, so if you can put up with it, then you might enjoy this, but be warned, it's a slog. I guess that does it for this round. As always, more videos to come. I've got some stuff in the works, but it's becoming increasingly hard to find time to work on stuff when work has my nuts in a vice. See you next time!